God made a promise to David about Solomon, that David's kingdom would be established through him. A promise, my friends, that had no condition attached to it. So we know that God spoke and clearly made a distinction between the other promises, which the critic doesn't disagree with. Then we have the critic clearly jumping over these clear verses and just hopping onto the conditional one and stating that this in some way makes his case. Again, common sense would tell you that a promise cannot be at the same time forever and conditional unless stated otherwise within the promise, which we stated was the case of his earthly kingdom, that if he would stay on the path of the Lord, that kingdom would last forever. And as we saw, that his commitment to the Lord wasn't sufficient enough to keep the conditional promise, and thus we see that the condition was later fulfilled because his power of the earthly kingdom was toppled by the Egyptians, as God said when he spoke to Solomon regarding the reign of his future son. Now, this again is where common sense would also come into play, because when I was speaking to Michael Brown, he even stated that the promise of the eternal throne to David was not conditional, even when it used the same terminology. So they believe that the notion of the throne does exist apart from the earthly throne. However, they don't believe that this was the promise made concerning Solomon, even though it uses the same terminology. And actually, the Christian critic seems to disagree with Michael Brown here, stating that there is no such thing between a throne that's forever, as promised to David, and a throne that's earthly, finite, and conditional. So again, I assume that every time it mentions the throne of David, I guess in the critic's opinion, David must still be alive. And again, in all my videos, I've done nothing but quote sources that prove that every place in the Bible where the promises appear, there was a clear distinction made between the promise of the earthly kingdom and the eternal kingdom, or throne, that was promised to David, which we see being established through his son Solomon. Because the promise is actually David's promise, and when God speaks to Solomon about the promise, it's only as an extension to the promise that he made to his father David. He then quotes 1 Kings chapter 9 verse 4 through 5 in some way to point to his argument that there is no difference between the two promises. Friends, this is just referring to the throne of his earthly kingdom, not the throne of his father David, which he established as God said. Or again, is God a liar? And again, he's clearly not thinking here, because you can't treat verses as if they don't exist when they do. And again, my friends, what were those promises? One, that God would establish David's throne forever through his son Solomon, and that God would establish his earthly kingdom and throne forever if he didn't stray from the Lord. And as I said, that when God makes a promise and states that it is forever with no condition attached to it, and then doesn't abolish the promise or state it was conditional elsewhere, we have no right to state that it is, because by doing so, we would be making the Almighty into a liar, chas v'shalom. But again, the speaker mashes up these two promises into one, with in some way having the conditional one outweigh the unconditional one. And remember, friends, why all the drama? Why are we doing this? All this is because the church is trying to justify the genealogy in Luke, a genealogy that everyone would agree is missing many, many names, and has many names added to it that don't even match the account in the Hebrew Bible. But you know what? In some way, God realized that someone in the future might try to make this argument and try to nullify his own promises in Scripture when he clearly stated they were forever. And that's why he planted these verses in Scripture, confirming what I've been telling you all along, that the promise of the eternal kingdom was made to David and had been established through Solomon. Please, listen carefully, because this clears up the whole issue. 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 12 through 16. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, speaking about David here, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom, speaking about Solomon. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul. Here stating that he won't let him fail, whom I removed from before you. Your house, speaking to David now, and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne, again, speaking to David, will be established forever. Again, your throne and he's speaking to David here, will be established forever. That means it wasn't established in the time of King David, but only in the time of Solomon. Which clearly states that the throne that we see here being established for Solomon is the throne of David. The throne that every Christian would have to say is forever if they claim Jesus is ruling from it today. And remember, the critic claim that no Israel means no throne. And there's more, my friends. 1 Chronicles chapter 17, verse 23. And now, Lord, let the promise you have made me concerning your servant and his house be established forever. Here is clearly referring to David's house, which was not established in his lifetime. Do as you promised, so that it will be established and your name will be great forever. Here again, he makes a comparison between his throne being established forever through Solomon and God's name being great forever. Then men will say, the Lord Almighty, the Lord over Israel is Israel's God, and the house of your servant David will be established before you. Friends, it doesn't get clearer than this. The promise of the eternal throne was made to David and was being established through Solomon. Now, I have to teach not only Christians, but everyone listening how to understand Scripture. And I made this point to Michael Brown in our debate, that the way we understand the will of God in Scripture is by weighing verses. Now, I must tell you that this is not really applicable in the case above, because God has told us what his will is. But if we find the verse in the outset that seems to contradict another verse, we stop and weigh it out against the other verses. And if you notice that there are more verses that claim one thing than the other thing, then that's what God is telling us. And I'm sure I don't have to mention that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, outweighs anything that came later in terms of scripture hierarchy, including the writings and the prophets. Or if a statement is made by a character in the narrative, but then God himself makes another statement, I obviously don't have to tell you that God's statements outweighs the other statement. Again, leading us back to the principles of understanding scripture. 1. Source material. 2. God speaking. And 3. Common sense. This is how you study theology, not this gotcha theology Christians practice. Now, remember, in all my videos, I never appealed to what the rabbis or church fathers stated, but only to what appears in the text and to common sense. Like when the speaker said that he doesn't believe in replacement theology and then says, no, he just believes that the church is covenant Israel and the Jews are not. Remember, common sense. Friends, what's the difference between that and replacement theology? Because if we read the narrative carefully, we see that the nation of Israel was appointed as God's holy nation. But now, according to the Christian's interpretation, now the church is Israel. Doesn't that mean that the church has replaced covenant Israel? Common sense. And again, common sense is in order here. Obviously, look friends, if God's will for his people was that through them keeping his commandments they would be a light unto the nations, how is the church going to move in and obtain that covenant when they no longer keep God's commandments? Because as Christians teach, they have been fulfilled by Jesus, when even God said that they were eternal. We also see that was the main reason he punished Jews throughout history for not keeping his commandments. Friends, let's stop and analyze this for a second. Here we have God speaking, stating that his commandments are eternal, which I said was a second principle, and we have no other source text disagreeing to that fact, which is the first principle. And now, through the death of Jesus, which the speaker said made it that we as individuals no longer have to keep God's commandments in order to be considered righteous before a holy God. And like I said, now this is the third principle, common sense. This is completely ridiculous. It can't stand. And you guys claim to take the Bible seriously? And then he claims that Jews who do not accept the Messiah are condemned by the Almighty. And when I asked what passage in Torah will condemn them, he said Deuteronomy 18. And when I showed him that Deuteronomy 18 was clearly referring to Joshua, then he stated that the passage also foreshadows the coming of Jesus. He then said that all the prophecies that I explained were also fulfilled in their own time, but still foreshadowed Jesus of Nazareth. So in other words, if there was never a clear commandment to believe in the Messiah when he arrived, so why is every person who does not accept Jesus in their heart condemned to hell? Again, common sense is in order here. Not to mention that if the church is now covenant Israel, wouldn't he agree that Where Israel may have stumbled in biblical history, the church has completely fallen and remained flat because this world has never known such destruction since the church has claimed to have picked up the baton that supposedly biblical Israel dropped. And again, if you notice, my friends, every prophecy he brought up, I clarified extensively as being fulfilled in the biblical narrative. But again, he then states that they were double prophecies that can be also attributed to Jesus. Clearly no exclusivity, which means that with that form of thinking, you can make the Bible justify any silly event in current history. No, friends, in order for a fair and honest God to close the case for the Messiah's arrival, the individual would not only have to fulfill circumstantial prophecies that appear in Scripture, like being from the tribe of Judah and being a nice guy. Why? Because those prophecies aren't exclusive to any individual. No, friends, for him to be the undisputed Messiah, he would obviously have to fulfill prophecies that are only exhaustive and exclusive, again, for anyone to be condemned for not believing him, right? Especially if the penalty is an eternal damnation. Again, my friends, common sense. And if you think about it, with that form of thinking, if I was from the line of David through Solomon, I could also be the Messiah. Just wait for my second coming for me to fulfill the prophecies that only the Messiah could fulfill. Remember, my friends, Scripture and common sense. And what are these prophecies that are exhaustive and exclusive? 1, building the third temple, Ezekiel 37 verse 26 through 28. Gathering all the Jews back to Israel, Isaiah 43 verse 5 through 6. Ushering in an era of world peace and ending all hatred, oppression, suffering, and disease. As it says, nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither man learn war anymore, Isaiah 2:4. And spreading the universal knowledge of God, which will unite humanity as one, as it states, that God will be king over all the world on that day. God will be one, and his name will be one. Zechariah 14 verse 9. Now, friends, these are prophecies from Scripture that no one can fake.